Rivers, I'm delighted to welcome Chris Gosden. Thank you for coming. He's also our president of the Friends, which is we're very pleased to have you as our president. Thank you. And our talk is a book he's written, The History of Magic, and I asked Chris to come because I thought it was a really complimentary to Marina Abramovich's exhibition, which is got bits of magic in it too. So I look forward to hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for coming out on such an unpleasant evening. And I must say, yeah, I'm very happy to be president of the Friends, the place that's closest to my heart. I think the Pitt Rivers. On the 16th of April, 1872, a group of men were drinking in the Barley Mow pub in Wellington, in Somerset. And as they sat there on a Sunday morning, there was a wind blew down the large chimney and 4 objects fell into the room in front of them. And this is one of them, which is now in the collections of this museum. This, as I'm sure you can all tell, is an onion. And it's an onion with a sort of spring through it, and it has pins in it. And at the top part of the onion, there is a piece of paper with a name written on it. And the name on this particular onion is a man called Joseph Hoyland Fox. The pub, the Barley Mow pub, which I got, there we are. Barley Mow pub, which some of us did very difficult ethnographic fieldwork in the Barley Mow pub just to see where the fireplaces were located and what was going on. So the Barley Mow is still there in Wellington in Somerset. And this is a quote which is more or less what I've said to you from E.B. Tyler, who we'll come back to in a minute, who was the first curator, first keeper of the Pitt Rivers. First of all, the University Museum and then the Pitt Rivers Museum. So this is Tyler. I'll let you read it. So there were 4 onions fell into the area where people were drinking, into the bar, and they each had people's names on. So this was 1872 we're talking about. The pub had opened about 10 years previously, but there'd been a considerable battle within Wellington as to whether a low cottage ale house, I think Tyler calls it somewhere or other, whether it should be open or not. And the name on the Pitt Rivers onion, Joseph Hoyland Fox, was a cousin of Tyler's and was a Quaker. And as a Quaker was opposed to the opening of a pub in Wellington. And a couple of the other people so named on the onions were also Quakers, also had been actively campaigning to prevent the pub from getting a licence. The landlord of the pub, Samuel Porter, was said to be the 7th son of a 7th son and was reputed locally to have magical powers. And he put these onions up the chimney so that as they dried out, they would harm the people named on the pieces of paper, and they were people who, in turn, had tried to stop him opening the pub, stop his business. So one thing we could see about this is that it's part, in a sense, of what one might call the weapons of the weak. That the middle classes of Wellington had taken Samuel Porter to court to stop him. He was unable to properly resist, although he did enough to open his pub. But then his further point of resistance was these onions, which were attempting to harm the people. And as we happen to know, all the people named on the onions lived happily for quite a long time after the onions fell out of the chimney. So you can make that. Well, so it's not a murder mystery or anything like that. But the attempt was obviously there. And as I say, this particular onion is in the collections of the museum here. It came into Tyler's hands because his wife, Anna Tyler, came from Wellington, and they lived in a large house called Linden House in Wellington It's now an old people's home. And Tyler heard about this story and inquired as to who the men were, interviewed them, and collected 4 of the onions. Only this one, which exists still in the collections. We don't know. We don't know what happened to the others, except that one of them he gave to who lent to his friend Lord Avebury, who was also interested in these magical practices, and Avebury never returned his onion. So Tyler instituted various forms of investigation. He asked at the post office, did all the obvious things. But one of the things he also did was consulted a seance as to what Avebury had done with his onion. So in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Tyler and Avebury and a whole range of people across the middle classes and the aristocracy of Britain became fascinated by magic in its various guises. Tyler was both fascinated and shocked. So here he is. You all know him, I'm sure. So he arrived in Oxford to be keeper next door in 1883, which was the year when the Pitt Rivers collection, the agreement was made for the Pitt Rivers collection to come to Oxford, arrived here in the following year. Tyler was shocked by these magical practices, and we'll come to some more of them in a minute or two, and he designated them as survivals. So what he meant by that was something like living fossils. He couldn't believe that in progressive late 19th century Britain, there were still people practicing magic. So he sort of rationalized this by saying that these magical practices were survivals in relatively isolated communities. In 1871, the year before the onions fell out of the chimney, he published a book, one of the most influential, probably the most influential book on anthropology in the 19th century, called Primitive Culture. Not a term we would use today for very obvious reasons. And at the heart of that book was his argument that the intellectual history of humankind went from a belief in magic to a belief in religion to a belief in science. Tyler himself is interesting because he, like his cousin and his wife and so on, was born a Quaker and for a lot of his life through to 1864 was a Quaker. But then renounced his Quaker faith, not very publicly, but we found documents that show he did, and partly because of his sort of self-styling as a scientist. So for him to find magical practices in Britain, which for him was, right at the heart of rational, scientific, modern ways of thinking, was quite deeply troubling. And as I say, he did a whole series of things. He consulted seances, most of which he was able to dismiss, a couple of which he wasn't entirely sure what was going on. And he collected a whole range of objects, or people brought him a whole range of objects when they found out he was interested in magic. So he collected some fairly sort of straightforward things in a sense. There are some potatoes carried by an old man to help him with his rheumatism. There is, rather more weirdly, and this has disappeared, fortunately, because it would pose problems for the museum today, the tip of a human tongue. Which was brought to him in the house next door where he lived, in an envelope. And nobody was quite sure what the tip of the human tongue was doing, but it was something to do with magical practices. So Tyler wrestled with the nature of magic, the nature of rationality, the nature of human thought. And his intellectual scheme, the thought that people move from magic to religion to science, became very commonly used in the late 19th and 20th century. So Fraser, when he was writing The Golden Bough, possibly the most influential work on magic ever written, it essentially employed the same scheme. And Tyler said that anthropology was an emancipatory science, by which he meant that anthropology would help you recognize, in his terms, primitive practices and root them out. So he was not just sort of studying these things. He was engaged in part of that sort of high Victorian improvement of society. So Marina Abramovich, who I think she's one of my favourite artists. This is another one of the magical objects. I'm sure most of you know this. This is a witch ladder, also found in Somerset, not in Wellington. This is part of Marina's drawing of it. It's a series of feathers stuck in a bit of coarse rope, which was found together with a rocking chair, a broomstick, and various other things in the attic of a house not far away from Wellington. And there are conflicting stories about the witch ladder, whether it was used by witches to get into a house, whether it was used by the people in the house to keep the witch out, whether indeed it had anything to do with witches at all is a bit of a... So the documentation around this particular object is very interesting. But Marina Abramovich, as I'm sure some of you have seen, there's a video on the Pitt Rivers website where she talks about her art exhibition and her interest in magic. There's a very good interview between her and Claire Harris, which I also recommend. But Marina is interested in what she terms the energies of these objects. So what she's done in various ways is take a series of objects from within the museum and is trying to commune with them, I suppose, in various ways. And in doing this, I've got one more. So these are little rowan twigs. Also from Somerset. And the rowan tree is part of a whole series of different forms of magic. It's said if a child had a hernia, you would split the branch of a rowan tree and pass the child through, and then you bind the tree back up again. And if the branch healed back together, so would the child. So the rowan, for reasons that I certainly don't know, was seen to have a variety of magical properties, and these are little amulets made of rowan twigs, and Marina's here trying to feel their energy. In Marina's work, I think we see something of one of the great divides in how people approach the world. So many of us, I would hazard, I'm not trying to second guess what you believe, but many of us, I certainly deep down sort of believe this, think of the universe as mechanical, that it operates under, forces of gravity, of mass, of a series of chemical reactions of living growth, and that we can explain the universe, and this is certainly where Tyler was going and his confreres, in terms of these physical properties, and that's all we need to understand the universe. Many people, I would say probably most people today, and certainly in human history, believe something quite different to that in many varieties of ways, which is that the universe in various ways is sentient. It's not a series of brute forms of matter which are moved by forces and mass and those sorts of things. It's inhabited in different ways, depending on people's cultural backgrounds and beliefs, by spirits, by anima, by various things that animate it. And Marina, I would say, is closer to that school of thought. And I've worked in places like New Guinea, so a story that I've told often because it stayed with me. I worked in a part of New Guinea called New Ireland, a long, thin island off the north coast of the mainland of New Guinea. And a group of people I knew well took me to see a series of stones lying in grassland in a little glade in the rainforest. And these stones were sort of like little stalactites and things just lying there in the grass. And they said, under certain circumstances, these stones will fly around. And if you are skilled, you can watch the movement of the stones and they will tell you the future. So this story has stayed with me because it's caused me, sort of not quite sleepless nights, but I've thought about it a lot. In the sense that they clearly believe, I knew these people well, I respected them, I liked them. They were very, sensible, intelligent people. They believed what they were telling me. What I can't easily do is come up with an explanation that satisfies me that the stones do actually fly around. I mean, I thought maybe there could be a flood or something and they get moved around by the water. Again, thinking in more sort of mechanical terms. So I think there is a big divide in the ways in which people approach the world, and this will be one of the themes of what I'm talking about. So I'll come back. Come back to it in a sec. So this is so Marina Abramovich has done a little trail of magical objects. This is just a map of so you've got things like the witch in the bottle and all the very famous magical things. So for me, my interest in magic was sparked partly by working in places like New Guinea and partly by encountering and working with, puzzling through these collections. Before we go any further, let's just think about a possible definition of magic. So I've got two rather than one, both from French anthropologists stroke philosophers. So Lévi-Breuil, at the beginning of the 20th century, said that magic is human participation in the world. So for people who practice magic, who believe in magic, they believe that there is a continuity between themselves and the world, and that they can affect states of the world by doing things like, as we would term these things, telling spells, writing curses, doing a whole range of things which don't fit within a scientific notion of how one affects the workings of the world. So for people believing in magic, there is a sort of a lack of boundary, in a sense, between people and the world as a whole. And then Lévi-Strauss, in the middle of the 20th century, reversed this, and said that magic is a humanization of the universe. So in that sense, this is thinking about the universe as sentient, as inhabited by a spirit. And again, there is no division in that thought between what it means to be human and what it means to be a mountain, say. I've wrestled with Tyler's stuff for a lot of the last, 25 years or so. I think he was a really interesting thinker, but I disagree with him profoundly on his notion of magic. So here are his three terms, which he would have ranged in a linear way as progress from magic to religion to science. I think each of these three terms are an important part of what it means to be human, and we don't have to choose between them. Maybe slightly tricky, as I was just saying, to entertain all three at once. So magic definition, which you may or may not find satisfying, I'll be interested at the end. Human participation in the universe and a humanization of the universe. Religion is relatively easy to define, a belief in something transcendent, something beyond the human, a single deity or many deities. And science is a belief in the physical properties which can be mathematically modelled, ways in which we'd understand various parts of what we would see as both the non-living and the living aspects of the universe. I think pretty well everyone has some belief in each of these. They may not use these terms. So my friends in New Guinea, who believe that the stones can move and tell you the future, if they were building a house, when they're building a house, because they build their own houses, would have a sense of how large the central pole must be in order to hold up the roof, would have a sense of forces and mass and those sorts of things. They wouldn't call it science, but they would definitely think in those terms. But they might also well think, in terms of the spirits of the place and whether this was the right place to put a house and all of those sorts of things. And people have maybe more variably believed in religion, but I think many people have some sense of transcendence, whether they name it as a deity or not. And here we have Exhibit A. This is Isaac Newton. Again, a fascinating character. So Newton is often seen as the first of the scientists. So I'm not quite the first, but the quintessential modern scientist. Here he is, inventing gravity and looking at optics and a whole range of very scientific things. He was a member of the Royal Society, and the 18th and 19th centuries look back to Newton as one of the founders of certainly of physics and various forms of mathematics. Newton spent a lot of his time on alchemy. In his rooms in John's, I think it was in Cambridge, he had 2 furnaces. Which, if you think about a college health and safety committee today, I've got a couple of furnaces in my room and I'm trying to turn lead into gold. Eventually, he moved them out of his room and they were just outside the college in a hut, but he kept doing this. He spent a lot of time on biblical prophecy. He thought that the Bible could allow you to tell the future. He was certainly profoundly religious. So in a sense, Newton embodies all 3 of these, the alchemical side of things. He was quite astrological as well, would fit within magic. He was definitely profoundly Christian and spent, is most famous for being a scientist. And John Maynard Keynes said Newton was not just the first of the scientists, but the last of the magicians, which is quite, and I think both things are wrong, but they're sort of interesting. So, and I think, this is above my pay grade as a humble archaeologist, but I think in some ways he was attempting to develop a grand theory of everything. He felt that his science wouldn't give him a profound enough understanding of the universe. So he needed a religious underpinning, a more magical underpinning. So he was wrestling with these ideas and attempting to bring things together. He's got a diagram in one of his books, which I think is in the bod, actually, of the Philosopher's Stone, which now famous from Harry Potter, which would give you the key to all aspects of matter, fundamental. And he posited this as a sort of theoretical thing. So my main thought is that magic, religion, and science are not necessarily antithetical. They can be seen that way, but I don't think they should be. And many of us believe in many ways in all 3 of them. I won't say too much about this, but just to give you, we all know these things. So these are the aims, some of the aims of magic: protection, telling the future, diagnosing the past, what I've called relationship work, which is maintaining relationships with significant others, which may be people, but may be spirits, maybe gods. There's a lot of magic to do with sickness, health, and possession, and often people attribute sickness to possession rather than some form of germ theory. Understanding and affecting transformation. So alchemy is Exhibit A there, trying to turn lead into gold. Issues of raised by dying, death, and the dead. What happens after you're dead, how you die, all sorts of things. What I've called, slightly coyly there, manipulating desire. Love magic, which is obviously a very thriving aspect of magic. And one thing I would like to point out is I've divided these into benign and malign. So malign, you have sorceries and charms, curses, inversions of various kinds, black magic. But the list of benign magics is much longer than the malign. And we often these days tend to think of magic as malign. And there are lots of technologies. You can use words, either spoken or written. You can deposit things in the landscape. You can use lots of forms of divination or go to oracles and so on. material means of harm and protection. And I'll come back to this last one, partly because of Marina Abramovich. I'm going to talk in a minute or two a bit more about art and magic, because those are two of the things I've thought most about. Whether productively you can judge, but it also links into Marina Abramovich. So this is the sort of history of magic, if you like, in a slide, and obviously it's a vast series of generalizations. So early on, probably magic was the dominant force. In the sense that we don't see very developed, science as we would. People had sort of folk science rather than formalized science. So before the Metal Ages in the Middle East, prehistoric Europe, and the steppe, and also in these periods and areas, we don't see formalized religion. It's only once you get into the Bronze Age in places like the Middle East that you get structures that you can recognize as temples. There is a strong element of magic in both China and Africa, where magic and human lineages are joined, in that it's thought that the well-being of the living is dependent on the actions of the ancestors. So the ancestors protect the world of the living, and a lot of effort therefore goes in to honouring the ancestors, to carrying out various forms of ritual to make sure the ancestors are content and likely to look after their living descendants. There are periods where magic and religion more or less operated as equals in Mesopotamia, Egypt, ancient India. Early medieval Europe, the Protestant church's main criticism of the Catholic Church was that it was a vast mechanism for the production of magic. So in many areas and periods, religion is not antithetical to magic. It's very much tied up in magical practices. There are periods where religion becomes a bit more dominant. People become a bit more uncertain about magic. Ancient Israel, Greece and Rome, religion is more the rhetoric of society. And then there's a relatively recent period in a relatively small area of the world, which is post-medieval Europe, which was then spread to various other parts of the world through the European colonial diaspora, where people believe, this is now Tyler, believe in science, religion and magic in that order. Doesn't mean to say that magic is gone, but people are, keep quiet about it and don't talk about it very much. And the main point I'd like to say about magic. So for Tyler, magic was traditional knowledge handed down from time immemorial in an unchanged form. And that's what made it a survival. People handed it down from one generation to the next. Whereas actually, when you look at magic, just like science, it's very experimental. We tried this last time, didn't quite work. Maybe we'll do a bit more of that. Maybe the demon didn't like the thing that we did. And because of that, just like science, it has quite well-developed explanations of failure. Not everything works all the time, but just because it doesn't work all the time doesn't mean to say you stop believing in it. Just because your scientific experiment doesn't work out doesn't mean to say everyone thinks, oh, well, science is bunk, and the same is true of magic. Okay, that's another general points. And this is a slightly sort of random whistle-stop tour of various magics. Exhibit A, Stonehenge. Stonehenge, every age gets the Stonehenge they deserve, but Stonehenge, if it's anything, is to do with the passage of the sun. So Stonehenge, this is reconstructed Stonehenge. It's much more dilapidated than that, as of course, as you all know. But in its sort of pristine state, not that it ever really had a pristine state, in midsummer day, dawn, the sun's rays pass through these two stones called the heel stone, and they hit that other stone called the altar stone. It's not an altar, but who cares? Which is right in the middle of Stonehenge. So whatever else Stonehenge is doing, it's doing something with the passage of the sun, possibly also of the moon, and also conversely, of course, on the day that we're coming up to, which is the midwinter's day, then the sun comes from the opposite direction and strikes the stones. One of my favourite monuments, White Horse Hill. It's one of the most, we dug up there in 1985. What is it? Why is it then? And of course nobody knows. But I mean, to put the effort into carving this, and it's a constructed feature. It's not just people taking the grass off, on a particular point in the landscape. And people have also said that this may well be to do with a sun or a moon symbol, because in Indo-European mythology, the sun and the moon were often seen as being on a chariot pulled by something like a horse. So there may and White Horse, the White Horse at White Horse Hill is a 1000 BC. Stonehenge is 1,500 years older. So if it's true that they're both connected by an interest in the sun, the movement of the sun, then we're looking at a very sort of long-lived set of things. I'll just talk a little bit now about the Eurasian steppe, the area from Mongolia across to Europe in the Iron Age, so in the last millennium BC, 1000 BC to getting on for 0 BC, and talk about art. Because I think there are an amazing series of things. So this is we're out in the east now, in present-day Siberia, just north of Mongolia. And there are a series of these burial mounds that were constructed between the 9th and the 7th centuries. They're quite amazing mounds. For instance, at the front here, this one has got a lot of Bronze Age rock art, which was already ancient when this mound was constructed, which was brought from several kilometres away, cut out of the rock and placed into this mound. The mound itself is made of all sorts of materials, mud from a lake over there. It's like a little map of the region. And in the middle of it, well, not quite in the middle of it, but near the middle of it, are these two people buried in some of the most sort of spectacular material you could ever imagine. There's a lot one could say about this, but one of the most amazing things is this man's trousers. He's wearing gold trousers, and they are made of many thousands of tiny little gold beads sewn into his trousers. Which is not really what I want you to focus on. One of the things that about this period and area is what's seen as a whole series of animal forms of art, which people wore all over their bodies, horses, deer, fierce animals like tigers and so on, quite charming animals like little pigs. And these animals were often in... I thought it might be my phone, which never rings. These animals were transformed into various juxtapositions and combinations. So a bit further north of where we just looked at, the Arjan Mounds, is a little plateau which is very cold, and people buried people in the ground, and they immediately froze. This is a place called Pazyryk. And because they froze, you get amazing preservation of organics. So this is a person wearing a slightly sort of comedy hat. So the hat is made of leather, and then there's this wooden bit that comes up quite a long way. So this is a drawing of it, and what you won't really be able to see, but down here is a deer that's turning into geese, and up here, which you might be able to see a bit more clearly, is some sort of rather nasty looking bird with animals, horses coming out of its head, and then a deer, because it's got leather antlers coming out, and then a bird flying up the side. The thing about these forms of art is that they meld, confuse, transform different sets of species. So they're the opposite of a sort of Linnaean attempt to sort out all the species. What they're trying to do is confuse things, and then they confuse them by connecting them to people. So if we think of magic as human participation in the universe, this is magic as human participation in the animal and bird aspects of the universe. And again, we don't know what people were doing because we have no written records, but they may well have been appropriating the powers of various animals to themselves. People, because these are ice tombs, people had tattoos, and again, of sort of transforming animals. This just gives you a sense. This is a set of horse harnesses in wood with various different, and then this thing is amazing. This is a saddle cover. Not only is it incredibly beautiful, so it's about 2,400 years old, and this is looking at it from above, so the person would have sat on this bit. And you've got a sort of griffin type thing devouring a ram or something like that. And again, they're all tangled up and mixed up with each other, and one is transforming into the other. So I would say the worst question you could ask of this art is, what is it? Because it's all sorts of different things. So it's a form of alchemy in a sense, I would say. And here we have Getafix the Druid from the Asterix comics, one of the great philosophical characters of world literature, to remind us that the Iron Age was very much involved with magic. And we're now in Europe, a related series of styles that go right across. This is a little fibula, a little safety pin that would have held people's clothes together, their cloak together. And again, the what is it question. So at this end, you have something that looks a little bit like a human head, maybe. Another human head there. Then you've got a couple of sort of sea creatures. I've got another view of it, so you can see these two creatures, which maybe are a bit more like seahorses. You can see in this view, this human head has long hair coming down here. And again, it's deeply ambiguous. And one thing you could ask is whether these were two creatures or whether it's one creature opened out. So you can see both left and right sides simultaneously. And if that's true, if it's a bit like cubism, that you can see different angles of the same object all at once. So that is not something you can normally do, in reality. So again, this is something worn on the human body, which is playing with form, playing with connections, playing with transformations in a way that I would see as deeply magical. And this, much later, obviously, we're now in the 6th century AD in Britain. This is the Sutton Hoo helmet, one of my favourite things in the British Museum. So it's an iron helmet with various bits of bronze on the front. So the thing that appears to us most obviously is that this is a human face. And then we might recognise that there's a bird coming down here. And in fact, although they're quite heavily decayed, the wings came down over the helmet. But then you also realise that it's meeting another bird coming up here. So that what we may initially have thought of as eyebrows are in fact the bird's wing, and the moustache is the bird's tail. So is this a person? Is it two birds? Is it some combination of the two? Again, we don't know, but I mean, this is highly skilled stuff, and people are playing around with form and ideas of sort of transformation, trickery, and so on that come out of the Iron Age, end up in the early medieval, well, not end up, come into the early medieval period, and then even later into illuminated medieval manuscripts. So you've got a very unpleasant looking bird here, with a little sort of face there, and all these poor souls in hell or limbo or wherever they are. And again, is this two birds, or is this both sides of one bird that you can see simultaneously? So some of the tropes, some of the ways of thinking about the world may move into early Christian imagery from this prehistoric past. A lot of magic is often attributed to shamanism. And shamanism is thought to exist in various parts of the world. This is a 17th century Dutch engraving of a Siberian shaman who has antlers and so on his head, but actually has animal feet. And a lot of loose talk is made of shamanism, and I think, you know, it's almost the sort of last refuge of the incompetent. If you can't think of how to explain magic, call it shamanism. I think shamanism obviously did exist. There are very strong traditions in places like Siberia, but whether we can think of the Iron Age material that I just looked at, we just looked at previously from the similar sort of area as shamanistic, I'm not sure. And shamanistic beliefs, as we know them from the last few centuries in Siberia, have a notion of three worlds, and they think of the world tree. So there's the roots beneath the ground, which is the spirit world. There's the trunk, which is the sort of living world, the world in which we inhabit. And then the upper parts of the tree, which are going into the heavens. And the shaman is able to move either down into the spirit world or up into the world of the heavens in a way, and intercede with the spirits. So if your reindeer are dying or some catastrophe happening, which is believed to have spiritual causes, then the shaman can take the risk of entering these other worlds and hopefully come back unharmed. And this is a early 20th century shaman. It's got a rather nice, well, not particularly nice, but a bird on his head. And unfortunately, I quite like this because a good friend of mine is just retired as Professor of Archaeological Science, and here in Oxford he smokes a pipe, and I think this looks very much like him, but I put that to him and he denies it. Unfortunately, shamanism in this form was very definitely suppressed by the Russians in the early 20th century. But now if you go to Siberia, if you go to Mongolia, there's a big resurgence in shamanism as a sort of, you know, post-colonial movement, as it were. Moving closer to home, just to give you a bit more of a whistle-stop tour, many people in the past, here we are in 17th century Wiltshire, so not so far from Somerset, but a couple of centuries earlier, people were worried about demons getting into your house. And they got into the house by the obvious ways. They came down the chimneys, they went through the windows or through the doors. So many houses had protective marks or protective forms. So next to chimneys in many older houses, there are these voids which are now seen to be deliberately built into the house. And they were filled with things like shoes and a whole range of different things. So this is the contents of one of these voids that's been excavated. So this has got all sorts of things. There are shoes here. There are bits of furniture. There are all sorts of things that were there to protect the house from demonic attack, demonic possession. And then there are these things called hexafoils or daisy wheels. And they're interesting because once people started recognizing these, they are everywhere. And they're not only in houses of a particular age, you find many of them in churches. And it's thought that a demon, not being desperately clever, for some reason gets involved with lines and will follow a line. And if the line has no end, the demon won't be able to stop looking at it. So these daisy wheels are there to confuse a demon. And as I say, people are doing surveys of churches and so on, have realised there are really a lot of these preserved in churches, but also in houses. And they also spread into colonial America, so I've seen some in a 19th century house in the highlands of Tasmania in Australia. So these things were exported with Europeans in a way that doesn't make the sort of official historical records, but people were obviously very keen to keep demons out of their houses. And this is an Australian house, as it happens, and various areas of attack. So all sorts of things. You get these very poignant things. You get tiny little kids' shoes, which were in recesses in the walls to protect the children of the house from possession, attack, and what we would see as illness and death. So people were very serious about these things, and you find a lot of it. Marina Abramovich talks about energies. She talks about being able to feel things like the witch's ladder, the rowan tree amulets, the various things from other parts of the world, and feeling energies exuded from them, which I think is very interesting, very bold in a sense. I'm not sure whether I could think I feel those, but I would like to. And again, this is above my pay grade as an archaeologist, where I've been able to get close to these sorts of things is through an very amateur reading of things like quantum mechanics. So these are two entangled particles. So these are tiny little subatomic particles, basic building blocks of matter. And they have various properties of spin and polarity and things. And when one changes a property, say of the way in which the component parts spin, the other one will do so instantaneously, and they will do it faster than the speed of light can pass between them. So physicists have recognized these entangled particles, but they've got no means within current physics of explaining them. And they've possibly, because of lack of any other language, they've started to say that these particles might be conscious of each other. And I really like that, because if the basic properties of matter are conscious, then your average animist would say yes. Yeah, we've told you this all along. You scientific lot, keep up. We knew this way before you did. So some of the more experimental and interesting fringes of science, there are things that are not a million miles away from magic, and certainly are to do with energies and energetic transformations. So I think I've been experimenting, as you could tell, a lot with thinking about, is the universe sentient? And I think this is an important question because we almost certainly need to reset our relationship with the planet. I mean, whatever we're doing now, we can't keep on doing it. And we can't keep extracting the amount of matter and energy that we are from the planet. And if you have a sense that the planet is sentient, that the universe as a whole is sentient, then you've got the basis for quite a different relationship with it You've got the basis for a relationship of almost living, well, of living thing to living thing, and therefore of care and looking after. So I think magical thought, magical practices, magical ontology, to use a slightly technical term, is important in the present because it provides us the basis for thinking about the way in which we live today, and hopefully for developing a greater ethics of care than we have at the moment. Okay, thank you very much.
Chris,